quick one then on everyone's favourite photosynthesis. Now I think the best way to think of this is to use that original formula. So if we have carbon dioxide plus water, and then our arrow to show that it's changed to something, and glucose and oxygen. Now, once you've got this fixed in your head, everything else can kind of flow from this in photosynthesis. Now, of course, we should also add in here a light. Now, chlorophyll, it's usually written on the arrow or above and below, doesn't matter which way around, of course, to represent the fact that it's necessary in the reaction, but it's not used up. It's not part of the reactants or the products. So there's our formula. Of course, if you're doing higher, you will need to know it as... oops, dear me, I'm completely wrong already. CO2 plus H2O and C6H12O6 plus O2, and of course we would then balance it like so. So 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O, C6H12O6 plus 6 O2, and that's our balanced formula. Now, it might not be a bad idea when you go into an exam, as soon as you open the page and you can start, to write this formula down. It turns out to be the reverse formula of respiration, even though the two chemically are not the same. It's the same formula, but the other way around for respiration. The reason I say write it down first of all when you go into an exam, once you've written it down, you don't have to remember it again. So there's our formula. Now, if we take each bit one at a time and see how we can link all these things. So if we take carbon dioxide first of all. Carbon dioxide, basically the more carbon dioxide you give a plant, let's sort of think of it like this. So we've got a graph with increasing carbon dioxide and whatever we want to call this. Very often it's called the rate of photosynthesis. In other words, how quickly the plant is photosynthesizing. So if the plant doesn't have any carbon dioxide, there's no photosynthesis. If you give it some carbon dioxide, photosynthesis increases. The more you give it, the more it photosynthesizes. So we get this typical graph where it goes up and then it reaches a point where the plant can't work any faster and it levels off. What we would say up until it levels off, so when the graph's going up, we say that carbon dioxide is the limiting factor. The more we give of it, the more photosynthesis goes up. So we're only limited by how much carbon dioxide we've got. Carbon dioxide enters the stomata and enters by diffusion during the daylight when the stomata are open. Remember, the stomata are on the bottom of the leaves. Excuse me. Water next. Water's necessary. It's got to get into the leaves because this is where most photosynthesis happens. It's taken up there by the xylem. Remember the xylem tubes or the xylem tissue? These long strengthened tubes, strengthened with lignin actually, which is basically the substance that forms wood. And that's how the water gets up there. You don't usually get many questions on water and photosynthesis, but it's there. We'll deal with light and chlorophyll separately, just to do these first of all. The glucose. Glucose is pretty quickly converted into other substances like starch, where it can be stored in the roots, cellulose, which is what makes up cell walls, that's built from glucose, and it's actually used to make other things like proteins and fats. So it's used for various things. Of course, it's used to make chlorophyll as well, eventually. Worth mentioning here, to make chlorophyll you need the element magnesium. Okay, the reason I mentioned that, people often get, when they get on questions about what do plants get from the soil, whatever it may be, and they say things like, well, it's nutrients. Don't use the word nutrients, it's a bit too vague. Say instead things like they get magnesium, or they get soluble minerals. That's a good phrase to use. Soluble minerals like magnesium, which is dissolved in the water. Nitrate is a good one to mention as well. So that's always worth mentioning. Oxygen, similar to the carbon dioxide. Oxygen will diffuse out of the plant, because if you're making lots of it inside the leaves, you're building up the amount of oxygen in the leaf. There's all our O2, and it diffuses out again through the stomata, assuming the stomata are open. Okay. Light is another limiting factor. In fact, we get exactly the same shape of graph with let's just do, oh, my phone's just gone off. Let's do this down here. So if that was light, exactly the same thing as we had over here with the carbon dioxide one, we get this graph, it goes up and then it levels off. We'd say light is the limiting factor while the line is increasing or the gradient's increasing. When it levels off, something else is the limiting factor. So if we added some extra carbon dioxide, we could get it to go up to a higher level. Okay. In fact, the type of light, usually when we're talking about light, we're thinking of sunlight, but weirdly enough, it doesn't actually need all colours of light. It's only really red and blue that plants need. So sometimes you get experiment questions where they talk about different colours of lights. Green is not needed really by most plants, and we know that because plants look green because they reflect the light off. So the red and blue are the ones that are absorbed. The green isn't particularly needed. And if you're wondering, well, why don't you grow plants just under red and blue light? Well, that's something you could do. You might as well just use normal white light because it's cheap to get the bulbs, really. But only red and blue really doing anything. So we mentioned our chlorophyll as well, and this idea that it comes from the magnesium. In fact, if we're going to be very, very clever about it, we'd call it Mg2+, which is an ion, if you know your ions. So everything really just flows from that formula, and all the questions you get, they tend to get questions that will perhaps ask you about, give you an experiment and ask you to think what's happening in the experiment. And usually it's all about, you're either increasing carbon dioxide, you're increasing the light, or you're measuring how much oxygen's given off, all those kind of things. And a tip, I suppose, for this kind of thing, if you have some kind of table and it says, well, what's the pattern, blah blah blah, look at the numbers, look at the values, and put an arrow next to them. Do they increase, do they decrease? And it'll help you to see any patterns there. So when you get to your answer, you can say, well, as this one decreases, that one increases. So that will help you spot patterns. You might get a table that, I don't know, looks a bit like, maybe you get an increase and a decrease. Maybe it starts off decreasing and then increases again. Maybe it decreases and then stays the same. But just drawing little arrows on your tables of results can help you when it comes to your answering your questions. So that's a little tip for those. And one last thing on this is the link between photosynthesis and respiration. Now, I did say they were kind of the reverse of each other. I'm just going to sort of put it like this for a second. So if I drew that out, 6H12O6 plus, so I've not bothered to balance this, but I suppose I should do. Shouldn't I? I'll just put this in to be correct. There we go. That's photosynthesis. All right, I've bent the formula around. But going from glucose, C6H12O6 plus 6O2, to carbon dioxide and water is respiration. So you can think of this like a kind of cycle with respiration on one side and photosynthesis on the other. Now, they're not chemically, it's not, they're not the reverse of each other, but they end up with the same products and they have the same reactants. Now, the reason I mention this, they like questions on exams where they ask about both things at the same time. People forget that plants are also respiring. In fact, this is going on all the time in a plant. It's constantly respiring. It's just that during the daytime, you've got lots of photosynthesis happening as well. In fact, photosynthesis overpowers, if you like. There's more of it during the daytime. But during the night time, this is what's going to happen. And there's a classic question where they give you, it's called a bicarbonate indicator. And this is something that changes colour depending on how much carbon dioxide is around. So if I put a plant in the light, and they're usually sort of water plants. So here's a plant that lives in water in a test tube, and you can measure how much it is photosynthesizing by counting bubbles coming off it, little bubbles of oxygen. Okay. Now, as long as I shine a nice bright light on it, it will be doing lots of this. Okay. So what's happening in this is carbon dioxide is getting used up. So that will be low carbon dioxide. If, however, I took the same thing and covered it up so the light couldn't get through, well, there's no photosynthesis. So now we're going to be producing carbon dioxide. So that one would be high CO2. In other words, that one is mainly photosynthesis, that one is mainly respiration. And you get a different colour from the indicator. They then like to throw in an awkward one, which is the same thing, but they kind of half cover it up. So it's maybe in dim light, or they put a covering that lets some light through. And pretty much in that situation, the amount of respiration is the same as the amount of photosynthesis. So the carbon dioxide is kind of balanced out. And they like that as a question. That comes up quite a few times, so that's one to look out for.